Hey guys, how's it going? This is Natinator, and welcome back to part 1-2 of the series titled On a Hill. So let's get right into it. So as always, turn out the lights, get comfortable, and let the story continue. The next day, he rose early and made his way downstairs to be greeted once more by the landlord, but the man remained relatively quiet, which John found odd, since he'd seemed to be quite a talkative fellow when he first arrived. Dismissing his host as just another individual averse to mornings, John grabbed a light breakfast and then made his way back out to the farm to conclude the purchase of Dale's land. As he drove along the quiet country roads, appreciating the impressive landscapes even in overcast weather, the farm came into view. But in the distance, so too did the hill. He thought that it seemed a little more prevalent or imposing than the day before, with its crooked structure leaning toward the village in the distance, but quickly shook these feelings from his mind, regarding them as the after effects of the townsfolk and their superstitious behavior. And yet, there was something about that place. With only a few administrative duties to perform, John was hopeful that he could be finished by noon and then make the long 7 or 8 hour drive back to London, finishing up some loose ends before taking part in his usual routine. On a desk in his apartment sat a 30-year-old bottle of Balvenie malt whiskey, which he would pour a glass from after completing an important deal. This would be accompanied by a cigarette or two, the only time he smoked, as he couldn't trust himself to not succumb to the habit. A takeaway meal, and the next day off from work, to do as he pleased. These were the times he enjoyed the most, the conclusion of a deal and a little break before once again being sent to another remote corner of the British Isles. Sitting in Farmer Dale's cottage, John enjoyed the coziness of the place and its antiquated decorations, which reminded him of his grandmother's house as a child. Many of the facings were original, and he was certain that much of the house must have stemmed back countless generations. Dale himself seemed in a more pleasant mood than the day before, making his guest a cup of tea and a sandwich while John prepared the rest of the paperwork. As the old farmer pottered around with a kettle and a pair of cups in hand, John glanced through a nearby window, noticing that the house itself looked out towards the nameless hill a few miles away. Without thinking, he mentioned casually that those at the inn seemed wary of it too. On giving John his tea, Dale sat down at the opposite end of the kitchen table, stirring his cup thoughtfully. There was another silence, similar to that of the evening before, and despite the cozy surroundings, John once again felt uncomfortable. Then, eventually, that unsettling feeling gave way to annoyance. Why should he not simply ask why people were so afraid of it? These were just superstitions, and it was madness to think that in the modern age, people could still be swayed so easily by simple stories. After toying with the idea of remaining quiet, John finally broke the silence. "Mr. Dale, I don't mean to be rude, but ever since I arrived in the village, people seem to be acting strangely about that hill, and they treat me like I've committed a crime just by mentioning it." "Perhaps you did," he replied. Perhaps you shouldn't have mentioned it at all, son. With all due respect, I just wanted to know who owned it, as I thought it could be good for the area, an exciting property development. Pfft, property development, Mr. Dale scoffed. The only thing that should be done with that place is that the ground should be sowed with salt. It's just a hill. Just a hill. The old farmer trailed off for a moment, looking out of the window toward the uncomfortable subject of their discussion. Mr. Dale, John said, this time more softly. I've been to many scenic locations around the UK. I know that some areas have stories. They get a bad name, or just seem a little frightening. But in my experience, I have never come across any of them that couldn't be put down to simple superstition. I'll even prove it. Prove what, lad? Said Mr. Dale, suddenly apprehensive. I fancy a stroll before I head back to London. I think I'll take a look. Standing up abruptly, the farmer now appeared more anxious than angry. His upper lip quivered, and he had the appearance of a man who had been hiding a destructive amount of stress from the outside world, just waiting to be vented. "You mustn't go there!" he shouted. "Please, Mr. Dale, I didn't mean to offend you." John's thoughts now turned back to the deal at hand, and with nothing signed yet, he did not wish to jeopardize it with his curiosity. How would he explain that to his client? The old man slumped back down into his seat, as his eyes glazed over, as if fighting a losing battle against an onslaught of terrible memories. "I lost my son to that place," he said, trailing off. "Oh, God, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Dale. Please accept my apologies. Let's just forget the whole thing." "No, it's not your fault." The old farmer smiled across the table with a sorrowful countenance. "No one talks about my boy. I'm not allowed to. The locals think that just speaking about him and the others will somehow bring more misery down to the village." After a brief pause of contemplation, he broke down, saying, "He was a good lad. We're not built to lose our children. Oh, God." Burying his head in his hands, he began sobbing uncontrollably. John didn't know what to say. He could only offer, "I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" Wiping the tears from his eyes, Dale sat back in his chair mournfully. After a few deep breaths, he composed himself and then spoke, his voice quivering with held-back emotion. "No one knows when it started, and no one knows why." "What started?" asked John, his compassion now overpowered by his curiosity. "I grew up in this village, and even when I was a boy, people didn't have a clue. Sure, they talked about old stories, about a dispute between two powerful families which went back hundreds of years." Dale leaned forward, scratching the graying stubble on his chin, before continuing. "But no one knew their names. At least, no one who was willing to talk about the hill. The deeds to that land are probably sitting in some solicitor's safe with the owner living the high life somewhere, unaware of the price we've all paid." "Surely there must be a record of the owners." "I'm sure there is, lad. but you won't find anyone around here who wants to know. Over the years, the odd person would ignore the warnings and venture up there. Normally kids daring one another to have a go. But they never come back. Dale shuffled in his seat uncomfortably, as tears began to fill his eyes once more. My boy. He didn't listen, and just like the others, he went up, and then he was gone. Surely you went after him? Asked John in disbelief. Yes, I did. I tried to go up there, but as broken by grief as my wife and other children were, they pulled me back from the foot of the hill. They knew it would take me too. So, your son could have been up there, hurt, dying, and you didn't go after him all because of a stupid superstition? The idea that myths and lies could have resulted in a young boy's death enraged John. Yet, he felt ashamed of himself as soon as the words left his mouth. Dale suddenly flew across the table, grabbing his now unwelcome guest by the collar, battering him against an old stove. "Who do you think you're talking to?" Dale screamed, his voice shaking John to his core. For an old man, he was still as strong as an ox. For a brief moment, he thought that the farmer was going to hit him. But then, just as quickly, Dale relinquished his grip, turning his back. When you have 3 other children to feed, and a wife who would be heartbroken, you'd think twice about going up there too. Besides, a few of the boys from the village helped my wife and, well, no one would let me go. Not because they cared about me. Well, maybe some did. But mainly because they live in constant fear of that place, of what's up there. That it might come down and pay us all a visit. Straightening a chair, the old farmer scribbled his signature on the remaining papers, and then asked John to leave, which he did, after offering his apologies once more. At the door, both men gave their polite goodbyes, with Dale simply adding, "There's an old saying around here. Best leave alone. You'd be wise to listen to it." Despite being shaken by the old farmer's volatile reaction to his enquiries, John was still certain that he wanted to visit the hill. Knowing that those in the village would try to dissuade or even physically restrain him from doing so, he was resolute in driving there immediately from the farm. As he got underway, he thought that perhaps some good would come of it. He could break their fear of that place. But it was more so his stubbornness which now motivated him. He wanted to prove he was right, and if he discovered a piece of land perfect for development in the process, all the better. Getting there was more troublesome than he had first anticipated. While there was a small country road which led to the foot of the hill, it had been apparently blocked off by the villagers. An arrangement of large concrete slabs, red bricks, old wooden posts, and other discarded materials had been unceremoniously dumped at either end of the road, making entrance by car an impossibility, and by foot only with great difficulty. Seeing the very real and physical lengths which the locals would go to in order to stop anyone from accessing the hill, John felt an increasing impulse to reach its peak, and then return to the village, to let those below know how ridiculous they'd been. After leaving his car by one of the blocked entrances, he climbed over the stack of rubble with some effort, careful not to cut himself on anything which protruded, and then made his way along the road. For a moment, he considered what he might find on the hillside, and the very real possibility of discovering the grim remains of a previous visitor, thoughts which momentarily left him questioning his current course of action. The road was just wide enough for a single car, and it had obviously been left to the elements for some time, with large potholes scarring its surface, and deposits of mud and gravel covering the tarmac in places. As the hill came into view, he was struck by how much larger it appeared to be than he had estimated. From a distance, he would have assumed a quick hike to its peak, but looking at its incline arching away from him, he realized it would probably take around 2 hours to reach its crest, and that was only if a track, or at least good footing, could be found. Looking at his watch, it was early afternoon, but he believed he'd still have enough daylight to make it to the top, and then back to his car safely. It was there that he began to notice some of the strange landmarks, more peculiar features. It stood quite alone, with no accompanying hills around it, as if it had been left there in isolation, quarantined from the land itself. Its ascent seemed more pronouncedly crooked than it had at distance, asymmetrical, leaning slightly to one side in bizarre fashion, and its surface was covered in sporadic pockets of trees, while wild and untamed collections of long grasses, a tangle of dead yellow strands embraced, or strangled, by the green shoots of more successful strains invading all around. Most surprising of all was that there was a man-made path which ran up toward the peak, one which he was delighted to discover. It had been spared the onslaught of the wiry and spindly grass which had consumed everything else. For a moment, John considered that this was all a hoax, and that he was the victim of an elaborate joke, as the path looked well worn as though often used. But then, a much darker thought flirted with his rational sensibilities, that the hill itself was leaning inward, enticing visitors, welcoming them to an unknown destination. He quickly dismissed this notion and continued on. An old gate blocked the way. It was wooden, but had obviously been subjected to the ravages of the Scottish weather for some time, as its surface was partially eaten away by green moss and mold. As it creaked open, John stepped over the threshold, and, as the gate closed behind him, a shiver ran up his spine, accompanied by a mild nauseous feeling in his throat. If he had been superstitious himself, he would have said that the place was bad, that the air seemed foul, but he was not easily affected by such thoughts. It was more likely that something he had eaten had not agreed with him, rather than the hill itself acting upon his nerves. Wandering up the path, he attempted to make as good time as possible. The idea of making his way back down at night was not one to be relished, with unsure and unseen footing, and as the afternoon sky was already a little dimmer than it had been at noon, he marched up the hill with intent, excited to take in the view from the top. The incline increased slightly, and with it, so did the sporadic nature of his surroundings. The long grass had claimed everything bar the path, and as clumps of trees occasionally flanked him, He could now appreciate why the locals had come to fear such a place. The reeds of dead grass and ivy encircling each trunk, suggesting malevolent purpose. Some of the trees had even fallen over, taking unusual positions at steep angles, appearing as if they had been pulled into the earth, broken by the fingers of grass which had clung to the husks of wood like a very real leviathan. But while the idea was fanciful, somehow the hillside did indeed feel wrong, unnatural in places, and as John ascended it, a coldness began to creep up his arms. He had hiked before, and in his job had often been required to brave the wilderness while evaluating land. But this felt different. It was as if the land was affecting the temperature rather than the weather, making it increasingly difficult to ignore the oppressive atmosphere of the hill. Stopping for a moment, he rubbed his arms hastily to warm them, pausing to appraise his progress. He was astonished by how far he had actually climbed. He had been walking for no more than 20 minutes, but looking in the direction he had come from, he must have been at least halfway up the hillside. But how could he be? At every evaluation of the hill's size, it seemed to confound the previous conclusion. It was as if the place was warped somehow. John laughed at himself, at being so swept up in the impression of his surroundings. Yet the silence bothered him. No birds, no rustling bushes filled with rabbits, foxes, or even insects. Indeed, the entire hillside felt dead. No, not dead, he thought, but in the grips of death itself. It was, however, winter, so perhaps he should have expected the seeming sterility of the countryside. But the quiet still perturbed him.